fulfilled in Christ. So we're going to talk about 5 today. But there's things that that the Messiah would teach in parables, that he would do miracles. It actually was prophesied how Jesus would die. Very specific things written 1,000 years before they'd actually happened, or 500 years before they'd actually happened, in terms of piercing, things about crucifixion that was not yet practiced, things about his betrayal, how much money, his burial. Lots of things were prophesied. We're going to focus in on the ones that are around his birth here. So what I want to do is talk first of all about 2 specific ways that people try to discredit prophecy. So when you hear like, oh, Jesus fulfilled all these prophecies, if your worldview is that you doubt there's a God, then you've got to do something with those things. So it's been very common in human history to try to discredit prophecy. One of the common ways is to say, oh, well, that thing was written after Jesus actually accomplished it. That's why. So there's a time period when many of the earliest manuscripts of the Bible that we had were after Jesus. So you go like, oh, see, that was just written after Jesus was done and someone wrote this, and so that's why he fulfilled it. So have you ever heard that before, that the prophecies were written after him? Anybody? I see a couple nodded heads. Okay, thank you. So when you hear that, I want you to know that's just absolutely not true. How many of you have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Okay. How many saw them when they were in Grand Rapids? Hit some of the other campus. Okay. That was I think there's still about 50% that are not translated yet. But roughly in the late 1940s, early 1950s, these were discovered. And non-religious, non-Christian archaeologists date them to before Christ, at least 150 years, possibly 70 years before Christ, but no earlier than that, before Christ. So they were clearly written before Christ. That society, there's a lot of documents in there. Some of what's in there is from the Old Testament. So in fact, we have 19 different copies of the Isaiah scroll, which all say the same thing. So any of you know the book of Isaiah was written 500 years before Jesus. In fact, the first prophecy we'll look at is about his birth, was written in there. If you read Isaiah 53, it's so specific about the way in which Messiah would die. That's the one that people say it must have been written after. But archaeology tells us that it wasn't. Here's another thing that's kind of interesting about when they were found. Let me try to do this left, right. So if they were discovered and identified as being about 150 BC, the earliest copies of Isaiah that we had until that time were somewhere around 700 and 800 BC. That's about a 900 to 1,000 year gap. Here's what's interesting. You ever heard people say like, well, it all got watered down, the translation, like the old telephone game? You ever heard that one? It got changed along the way. 1,000 year gap. And when they compared them, it said the same thing. Very, very minor little thing. Everything major was the same. So when you hear that theory, it all got watered, it's not true. People say stuff all the time that's not verified. Do you believe what you read on the internet? Okay. Check sources. That's not true. Okay. So when you hear that thing about the prophecies were written after the fact, it's just not true. Second, when you hear sometimes, well, Jesus knew the prophecies. I mean, they were out there, so then he intentionally did those things to make it look like a fulfillment, which sounds kind of, oh, yeah, if you don't believe that he is, of course. But there are some certain things that were prophesied that Jesus had absolutely no control over. He had no control over how he would die, what other people would say about him, where he would be buried, or his birth. He didn't get to determine where he'd get to be born. How many of you know on your birth certificate what city you were born in? How many of you know that? How many of you got to determine that city? Jesus didn't get to determine Bethlehem, and we'll get to that later on, what God did to get him born there. That was a prophecy. There are many things that he didn't have any human control over that were prophesied long before. So we're just going to look at 5 today. Wi-Fi, and I'm not trying to be tedious, but I have something I want to do. There's something miraculous when we see this. So we're going through prophecies, some of them, so we pause and we realize the miraculous, and we realize this. These are not random events. This is not just a neat story. It's God planned, God designed for us. And we'll actually, in some of this, we're going to talk about the whole narrative of Scripture, why God did this. So here's a phrase that we're going to see along the way. In the Gospel of Matthew, which has a very Jewish flavor, so we talked about what makes the Gospel of John distinct. Matthew has this Jewish flavor, and here's this phrase he uses very often about these prophecies. He'll say, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. We'll note that today. Sometimes he says, just as it was written. Matthew drops that down in terms of what takes place. Okay, so he's writing, say, maybe 30, 35 years after it happened. He records the event, and then there's some of them he'll say, just as it was written. Jesus did this, it's fulfilling prophecy. Or just as the prophets had foretold. That's Matthew's commentary on that, and we'll see that. He wants us to see these are fulfilled prophecies. All right, but again, the goal for this, it's not to gain knowledge, so that we see it, and we wonder and worship at God. So that's how we'll try to do that today. All right, first one. Born of a virgin. This is prophesied in Isaiah 7:14. We'll look at Matthew 1:21. And next week we'll actually spend more time in the virgin birth. I just want to simply note today that this was prophesied. The virgin birth was prophesied. Yeah, you heard me correctly. Think about that. The virgin birth was prophesied. That is nearly as preposterous as someone prophesying, predicting their resurrection. Oh yeah, which, by the way, Jesus did also. Remember that? I mean, in Mark, he says this 2 or 3 times, that he's going to rise from the dead. Think of virgin birth. Isn't that term an oxymoron? Its very definition, virgin, man and woman are not together. Since all of creation, that's how we've known conception to take place. And here, prophetically written 500 years before Christ, it speaks of this. It's prophesied. Did the guy who spoke this, did he understand that when he wrote it? Probably not. Nevertheless, he wrote it. So, I want to just pause for a second to talk about the nature of prophecy, what it's like. So we'll look at some of these. Do we have any engineers, architects in here? Okay, yeah. So engineers and architects, if you've seen an architectural drawing, it's really precise. I mean, it's clear on a lot of stuff. Prophecy's not like that. Prophecy is more dreamlike. It's not like that. It's more like a mosaic. If you've seen a Monet or whatever, it's an impressionistic painting. It's more that way versus super precise. Or I could use another example. It's actually this term is used in the book of Hebrews about the Old Testament. Shadow. So a prophecy is like a shadow. So if it was a sunny day, we went down to the beach, and it was near the end of the day, like near sunset, and there was a shadow, and there was a shadow of my form. That shadow would represent this in some ways, but not precisely like an architect's drawing, more of an impression. So think of the shadow. Shadow is two-dimensional. It's one-colored, and it's a little bit elongated, a little bit distorted, but it is portraying, actually connected to the reality, which is three-dimensional, which has color, has mass. So it does something, but it's not precise. That's how prophecy works, just to understand that, okay? So we'll look at some of these prophecies. Here's Isaiah 7:14 on the born of a virgin, and think of how crazy it is that they would be prophesied to be born of a virgin. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Here, it just says this. Isaiah writes it. He's writing it obedient to God, but I don't think when Isaiah writes it, he understood all that meant. It's something that God's doing. You ever follow God and it's by faith and you don't know what he's doing? I think that's how the prophets are writing and how the prophets are speaking. But I want to look next at then how this is fulfilled. This is Matthew 1. So this right here, and we'll look at this probably more next week, this is the angel speaking to Joseph. Joseph's got trouble here, okay? Joseph sees that his engaged wife is pregnant. He comes to the one conclusion, the only logical conclusion that a person would come to. She's been unfaithful to me. He's meaning to put her aside. And God comes to him, sends an angel in a dream, and says this to him, Joseph, son of David. Interesting phrase, son of David, which we'll get to later on. It's actually a phrase of promise. Son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son. You shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. And then Matthew adds this, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. Matthew drops that in. Do you think that Joseph understood that at the time the angel's saying that to him? I don't. He knows that God appeared to him, and God gave him a message. He's going to be obedient to it, but he didn't understand it. Do you think Mary understood all that was? I mean, we'll see this next week. That Mary is visited. I don't think she understood. Just knows that God's doing something, and I need to be obedient to him. When I get to the end of this message, we're going to look at how did Matthew know this? How did Joseph know this was prophecy? We'll do that at the very end. All right, second one. Son of Abraham and son of David. So we're going to look at a couple things. I'm going to actually kind of do a big sweep of the Bible here. There's a Genesis reference, there's a David reference, and there's the Matthew. So who was Abraham? So I want you to think, the Bible is all these books together, but hangs together in one story. So if you go back to the beginning, here's Adam and Eve created in the image of God. They rebel. Adam sins. Sins comes into the world through Adam. All of us are tainted by that. All of us have a propensity to selfishness. Sin gets passed on, as it were. We need help. We need help from outside of us, okay? When we celebrate in the end, this is the help. It's Jesus who comes to save us from that. Here's Adam. So we go all the way down to Genesis 12. God determines he's going to take this one guy, Abram at that point, going to make a nation out of him. And he actually tells Abraham, he says, I want you to leave your family, everything you know. I want you to get up. And he plants him, I think it's about 700 miles. Go to the land I'm going to show you. He doesn't tell him ahead of time. There's no GPS. He just goes. God gets him there. Now when he gets him there, here's what he says. This is the promise God makes to him in chapter 12, verse 3. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of earth shall be blessed. Hint, mosaic, shadow, in you. Means there's something that's going to come from Abram. In Hebrew, they would have understood that. It's future ancestors. All the nations are going to be blessed from you. It's a hint. It's a whisper that comes out further in later scriptures. So there he is. Something's got to come from me. Abram definitely gets this. He understands this as kids. So we did this a couple of years ago, the Abram account. So you remember what he does. I mean, he's 70 when this comes. We're not having kids here. So eventually, about 10 years later, he finally goes to God and says, hey, God, would it be okay if the head of my, it's like a manager that he had, Eliezer from Damascus, said, would it be okay if Eliezer's my heir? I have no children to pass this on to. God says, that's not my promise to you. I said it's going to be in you. So we go about another 10 years down the road, and I think this is when he's almost 90. His wife says, hey, we got it. Like, God promised this. It's not happening. And she didn't say it this way, but you know how it is when you feel like you need to help God out because, we really want people to think well of you, God, so let me do this for you, And so she says, take my servant Hagar, have a child through her, which is really weird to us, wasn't actually that weird in those times, seeing that person as property and blah, blah, blah. So he does. He goes in with Hagar. She gets pregnant and has the son named Ishmael. And is that God's promise? That is not God's promise. And God tells him that and says, Abram, I promised you from you. And Sarah even laughs when she hears it. She can't believe it. She's past menopause. Abram's as good as dead. You know what that means? It's not working, okay? There are no long commercials on TV telling you, okay, there's nothing. It's not happening here. Good as dead. Past menopause. God said, I said to you, Abram's 100 years old when this child is given. It's miraculous. It's the child of the promise. And God did it. God's going to be faithful to his word. Well, here's what happens. He has this child, Isaac, the child of promise. It's maybe 10 years later where God tests him, probably a little bit longer than that. God tests him to take Isaac up on that mountain, Mount Moriah. He has to offer and surrender Isaac up. I cannot imagine how hard that is. God had promised all these things. He's testing him. Now, the book of Hebrews says this about Abram. Abraham believed at that point that God said he would provide. He didn't know how. So it said Abram actually believed in the resurrection. He felt like if God's going to take this son, he's going to raise him in it because God said it's this son. It's not Ishmael. It's not Eliezer. It's this son. And he knew God's faithfulness. He didn't know how God would do it. And God spared him. In that sense, he did provide. He did give the son back. Isaac wasn't killed. It's after that test, probably 40 years from the original one. Get up and go, and I'll bless you. And then you're probably 40 years later, after he's been tested with Isaac, God says to him in Genesis 22, he reaffirms it. I will surely bless you and surely multiply your offspring as the stars of the heaven and the sand is in the seashore. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. It's a whisper. All the nations are going to be blessed. I'm sending a Savior for the world. More understood later. I have to really skip so much of the story. He has a son, Isaac. There's prophecies. Messiah comes through Isaac. Isaac has two sons, Jacob and Esau. The Lord chooses the younger Jacob over Esau. There's prophecies the Messiah will come through Jacob. Jacob has all these sons who become the tribes of Israel. There's prophecies that one of those, Judah, which blends in with Benjamin, will come from that particular tribe. Benjamin, that's where David comes from. There's very specific prophecies about David. So I'm skipping 1,000 years or so. I don't remember a lot. It's probably about that. I didn't do the math. So now we go to David. David, you remember David and Goliath? Remember how Saul wanted to kill him? Remember David, the shepherd boy? God raises this guy up. And God has done incredible things in David. Now David's king, and God's done so much to him. He wants to do something for God. And so David says to God, man, I now am king. I'm in this palace. I want to build you a house, a temple, a building to worship in. Up at that time, God had been in a tent. If you remember the wilderness, they went in this tabernacle, this tent. He'd been in a tent all the time. When they finally came to the promised land, they'd been in this tent. Now David's established. He goes, I want to build you a house, something permanent. That's a good thing, right? What's God say? Thanks, but no thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. He actually says, David, yeah, it's cool. I don't need your house. I mean, I've done these things. It's nice that you want to build that for me. I don't need that. I've been traveling with you. I've been fine with that. And he says, in fact, David, I don't need you to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. I'm going to establish your kingdom forever. And that's where the Lord delivers this promise. Go back to Abram. This is the messianic promise, how it travels. Abram to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah, now to David. And that's the context when David wants to do something for God. And God says he's going to establish his kingdom. Here's what he says, 2 Samuel 7. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name. That's who's going to build my temple, your son. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Robin, leave that up for a little bit because I'm going to make some comment. I will establish the throne of his kingdom. How long? All right, so that doesn't land on us so well. Do you know why? A couple reasons. One is we live in a democracy. We don't get kingdoms. So how do kingdoms go? Think about human history. Guy's a king. He's king for as long as he lives. Sometimes when he gets old, he passes it on. But generally, it's as long as he lives. O king, live forever. Remember that phrase? And who does it get passed on to? Next. His oldest son. Unless someone knocked him off. Then it would be son number 2. It goes down the line. So throughout all the dynasties, you get guys that are king, and sometimes these other guys will get knocked off. In fact, we get to Herod actually. Herod was notorious for knocking him off. He doesn't want the pressure around. I'm going to establish your throne forever. Think about this. Who was the first king of Israel? It's not David, it's Saul. Saul rebelled against the Lord. Kingdom gets switched. The Lord did this. All those guys were wiped out because Saul was about himself. Saul had an opportunity. He did not serve the Lord. David comes in as his humble shepherd. God raises them up. That's the whole David and Goliath story and a whole bunch of others. God establishes David. And he goes, he's a shepherd. He's the smallest tribe in the nation. This guy's a peon in terms of what should be happening. I will establish your throne, the kingdom, forever. And throughout history, Hebrew history, when they heard that and the forever, they understood Messiah. They got that meant Messiah. In fact, so I read that pretty quickly, but in the Matthew account where the angel comes to Joseph and says, Joseph, son of David, that term son of David, when that was used, particularly in the New Testament, is it 1,000 years? 1,000 years later, after David. It's a messianic term. They all knew Messiah would be a son of David. When Jesus is coming to die, he's coming into Jerusalem. He's right at Jericho. You remember where Bartimaeus, who's blind, is there. It's the first time it's in the Gospel of Mark. Bartimaeus, the one who's blind, he calls out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And everybody else goes, shut up. He calls it out, son of David. The blind man has used a messianic language of Jesus when he comes in. We probably know Bartimaeus' name because he's part of the church later on. They all understood that term, and when you see it in the New Testament, that's what it is. It's part of this promise from 2 Samuel 7. So I won't go to this directly, but if you look in Matthew, actually you can do Matthew 1, the genealogy. That's why it's so important for Matthew to trace this genealogy through David's line and Abraham's line. It's all these prophecies. You can look at that in Luke also, but that's born as an heir of Abraham and David. Okay, that one was long. Next ones will be shorter. Born in Bethlehem. So I said this in the beginning. I mean, what did you have to do with your birthplace? We joke about this sometimes about a little baby. So babies, they don't determine where, they determine when. Like we say, like, hey, what's the due date? Well, the baby's going to come when the baby's going to come, right? That just happens, whatever the due date is. They determine when, but not where. So here we have in Micah 5:2, so this is about 700 years before Christ, that says, O you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who's to be a ruler in Israel, whose origin is from of old, of ancient of days. I should have underlined that last part. Whose origin is from old, from ancient days. There's some illusion there. There's the shadow. There's the impressionistic painting that Messiah will have pre-existed. Son of God pre-existed. There's illusion to it there. Bethlehem was a nothing city. Who are too little to be among the clans? I mean, Bethlehem made Galeen look like a major city. You know? I mean, it was a nothing town. It's prophesied in the book of Micah. Well, what do you mean? How'd they know that was prophesied? It was commonly understood that prophecy was. In Jesus' day, everyone understood that. You might remember this when we were in the Gospel of John last year, chapter 7, so that was around the summer, I think. There was a big debate about Jesus' identity, and they're watching the miracles, things he was doing, and some people said, man, this is the Messiah. And others are saying, no, it can't be the Messiah because he's from, remember this? Nazareth or Galilee. The Messiah comes from Bethlehem. Common people knew that. And it was debated in Jesus' day. Well, he's from Nazareth. We know where he's from. He's not from Bethlehem. They knew the prophecy. So were they right? Well, sort of. We'll see this later, but Jesus' family was originally from Nazareth. But Jesus was born, and we'll see what God does to get him there, in Bethlehem. And after Bethlehem, he actually has to run to Egypt. His parents take him to escape Herod. And after that, after Herod dies, they go back to Nazareth. So his family came from Nazareth. Most of Jesus' life was in Nazareth. But he was born in Bethlehem. So were they right? Well, they thought they were. He had been from Nazareth, but he was born in Bethlehem. Isn't it amazing how many times we think we know something and actually miss because we don't look long enough? We're not patient enough to ask the right questions. It was prophesied. They knew it. In fact, you remember this, that when the Magi come looking for the King of the Jews, remember what city they go to, first of all? When the Magi come from the east, they come to, not Bethlehem, they come to Jerusalem. Why do they go to Jerusalem? Well, they're looking for the King of the Jews. Jerusalem's the capital city. Where else would you go? So they come in, and they're asking, where's he born King of the Jews? And the whole city is upset. So let me look at, I think I have this, Matthew 2, verses 4 to 6. So they come to Herod. Well, who do you go to? The guy who's leading. And Herod then, assembling all the chief priests and the scribes, so what he did is he goes back and gets the Jewish scholars. Herod inquired of them where the Christ or the Messiah was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And they quote now Micah, "O you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." They know it's Bethlehem. Everyone knew it was Bethlehem. Think about this. What did it take for God to have this fulfilled? Jesus was not from Bethlehem, was he? How did he get there? The census. Do you remember this? The census was issued from Jerusalem. The census is issued from Rome. If you know your geography, think of the Roman Empire, world power. God takes an emperor who declares taxes to be paid. The way we know who's paying taxes is you go back to your family's birthplace of origin. So people are going all over the place. That's how Mary and Joseph get to Bethlehem at the very time, the appointed time, when she's ready to give birth. God did it. Why do we fret about anything? Who's leading what? Who's doing what? Kings are pawns in his hand. God will always be faithful. He will accomplish his purposes. He will. We can count on that. God does that to move Mary and Joseph there, and Jesus is born in Bethlehem. The fourth prophecy is being called out of Egypt. So you remember that commotion that was in Jerusalem, caused by the Magi, the king of the Jews. So Herod then says, I want you to go and diligently search for him so that when you find him, I might worship him. Everybody's in his court goes, yeah, right. Like anybody that's in your family line, they're already dead. Herod was notorious for wiping guys out so he could be king. Not the Magi didn't know that. They're from a foreign land. So they go. And they find the babe. And they worship him. And then it says, after the Magi left, Joseph is warned in a dream by an angel to flee to Egypt. And here's how Matthew records this. Now when they had departed, that's the Magi, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for your child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and mother by night, departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. And then Matthew writes this. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, quote, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, Matthew doesn't say which prophet, but it's actually Hosea 11:1, which reads, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. It's when Hosea wrote that, it's a shadow. Do you think Hosea knew that's what it was speaking of? No, he didn't fully know. He's obeying what God said. But it's a shadow. When did they figure it out? We'll come to that in the end. But God said it, it's out there. Even the rescue, the going to Egypt. So this prophecy is very closely tied to the last one, which is actually prophesied. It's a really sad, it's genocide that takes place. And it's the slaughter of the children of Bethlehem that Jeremiah 31:15 actually predicts. And Matthew records in chapter 2, verses 16 and 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he'd been tricked by the wise men, they don't return. He became furious And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and all that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. This was Herod's MO. He killed anybody that was a threat to him, including babies. Matthew records, then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. What took place there? God knew it was coming. But I'm telling you what's going on. Who's our enemy? Who's our enemy? So what's he want to do? He wants to kill, steal, and destroy all the time. Satan, the way he works is all the same all the time. He wants us to cloud God's goodness, to deceive us of truth, kill, steal, and destroy. Here's the Son of God, human flesh, as vulnerable as a baby. Come and get him now. Come and get him now. How can he be any more vulnerable? He's depending on parents. Come and get him now. That's what's going on with that slaughter. And God intervenes. It's a dream to Joseph. Joseph is learning to follow the Lord. It's the angel who comes and tells him in the beginning, Mary, what is in her is conceived by the Holy Spirit. And they go out to Egypt. Egypt was not their favorite place to go. That's where God took him, and he was spared. So, when were all these prophecies understood? When were they understood? So this is probably one of my favorite passages in the New Testament. I want you to write this one down if you're not familiar. How many of you are familiar with what it says in Luke chapter 24? Go ahead and raise your hand. How many? Just a couple. Okay. This is really important. Luke chapter 24. I'm going to show you two places. Luke 24 is after Jesus is raised from the dead. So how many of you are familiar with the story where he's on the Emmaus Road and he's with these guys, and then it's the phrase where he goes, and weren't our hearts burning within us? How many of you are familiar with that? A couple more, okay? So this is one of those places that happens. Jesus has just been raised from the dead. I think at this point, the disciples have not even seen him yet. And so he's walking on the road with these two disciples, and they're talking. Oh, I got to turn here, because I don't have this projected up here. It's 24 verses 26 to 27 is the first one. So he says to them, "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had spoken." He said, guys, don't you understand what the prophets spoke? Was it not necessary that the Christ, the Messiah, should suffer these things and enter his glory? They're grieving because this guy they thought was Messiah had been crucified. He's telling them, don't you see? This has actually been prophesied it would happen. Verse 27. Here it is. And beginning with Moses, that's the books Moses recorded, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. I'm telling you, if there's one scene in the New Testament I'd love to be at, that's one of my top 5. Jesus is tutoring them. He's raised from the dead. He's taken them back through all the Old Testament saying, don't you see, when it says, when David writes this in the Psalms, that's about me. Don't you see that? See this in Micah? This thing about the birthplace? That was me. Do you ever see this in Isaiah where it talks about a virgin being, that was me. The way in which I was crucified. He takes them through Isaiah 53. Their hearts were burning within them. It's like they saw it. And it's not just those two. Because later on in that chapter, verses 44 and 45, now he's with the remaining disciples. And he does the same thing with them. It says, these are my words that I've spoken to you while I'm still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then he opened their minds to understand the scriptures. He took them through it. Now they saw it. And that's what Matthew's in that room. Matthew hears that. That's why. When these events take place, now when Matthew's recording it in his gospel, here's what happened. Then he says, that was to fulfill what the prophet said. This is to fulfill what it was written here. He's showing us all this. When the events were taking place, they didn't understand it. It's later when Jesus shows them. All right. Why does all this matter when we walk out these doors? Why does this matter? So I hope this isn't simply an intellectual exercise, but there's a couple things I want to do. I wanted to look at it. I wanted to wonder at it. But here's what we should see. God is absolutely faithful. And he will be faithful no matter what's taking place, what's happening. He is faithful to accomplish his purposes. He cannot be otherwise. And this whole deal is for us. It's him pursuing us with his love. He's done that in very detailed ways. When I look at the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem, God will not be circumvented. He's going to carry his plan. Satan does not get a win. It just doesn't happen. When I look at Bethlehem, the insignificance of that little town, or this young girl who's from a know-nothing family, God is continually picking that which is insignificant to show himself in it. He does that around this room, does he not? He does. It's who he is. And when we read these events, we see that God is at work when we don't see it. All these people were part of these prophecies coming into real life. They didn't know it. They didn't know it until looking back after the resurrection. So I hope that encourages us in some way. But the immensity of Jesus' love for us and what God has done in this plan. So I love at this service, the way we end on this first Sunday at Christmas is around the Lord's Supper. Because all this was to provide for us, with his death, a payment for our sin and access to God to bring us to him. And that's how we're going to end this worship. So I'm going to pray. Worship team's going to come up, and then Mike's going to lead us through communion. Let's pray.